Today, I'm now happy to introduce Judy Hannen Moe, and you can see here a picture of her book. We hope people are interested in buying it. In fact, it's a fascinating book. She's been an active Baha'i all her life. She just told me that the last individual in this particular biographies that she wrote, Fanny, passed away just within months of Judy's own birth. So she just missed Fanny by a short period of time. She's been living in Rockford, Illinois for 45 years, where she lives with her husband, Bruce Moe. She's been active in many different things, social justice and interfaith work. She brings all of this experience, of course, to writing the book. The early American Baha'is were very involved in their current issues at that time as well. She's a retired teacher of English as a second language, and as I already mentioned, a great-granddaughter of Joseph and Pauline Hannen, about whom we will now hear. So, Judy, thank you so much for participating today. Welcome to the Wilmot Institute's Web Talks.
So I'm very excited to be and honored to be invited to do this, and especially from Mr. Stockman, because as you'll see in my presentation, his book was very, very foundational and very helpful in the writing of my book. So I start with this picture of the house of worship on the front of my program because I think it's helpful to just know a little bit about me, that I was raised just 15 minutes away from the house of worship, and it was very, very foundational in my childhood, going to Sunday schools and going to Sunday devotions and listening to wonderful talks that they used to have every Sunday afternoon. I would meet my youth group friends from the North Shore of Chicago area and South Chicago too, and people came from all over the area to the house of worship, and we got to know a lot of different people. So it was a very foundational in my life. My parents lived there basically their whole lives. They lived in that area. And really, from the time my grandfather was given a job there while they were building the house of worship, and he was one of the caretakers, and from that point on, they stayed in that area. So I'm thankful to them for that. So without further ado, we'll get a little bit more into this. For those who might not know, the very first mention of Baha'u'llah in America was at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago. And there was a few people who were very early Baha'is who were actually at that event and heard his name and were very interested because they were really seeking and looking for the return of Christ or some new message from God. And so they followed up on it. And one of those first, he wasn't actually at the event, but he read about it in the newspaper, Thornton Chase, and he followed up and contacted somebody who was a Baha'i that was living in America, but he's actually the first American to become a Baha'i. There was 5 other people, some of whom had heard about it there at the event or came with friends. One of them was a friend of Thornton's. And then Abraham Carrella was one of the people who first started teaching about the Baha'i faith in America. So there was this very small group, and all of these things can be learned about in other books. And one of those main books was, I have books here with me today to show you that Catherine Hoganson wrote a great book that covers that first 10 years of the faith in America and the first pilgrimage to Haifa. But a lot of those things are all covered in that book. So, but this book is really about the Hannens and the Knoblochs, who were my ancestors, as mentioned. The picture on the left shows Pauline and Joseph. My great-grandparents are on the right of the picture. The woman next to Pauline is Fanny. In several Baha'i books, this picture appears, and they say that that's Alma, but in studying all this, I figured out that Alma was not in the country at that time when the picture was taken, and Fanny is taller than Pauline and Alma is shorter than Pauline, so that has to be Fanny. And then Amelia, their mother, Amalie. People call her pronounce her names different ways. Amalie, I think, is how it should be. And then the young man, the child in the picture, is my grandfather, Carl Hannen. And then on the other side is a picture of Fanny and Alma, both while they were in Germany. So that's what the book is really zeroing in on. It brings in also some other relatives, which I'll get into as we go along here. For many years, my father kind of mysteriously didn't talk very much about the history of the faith in our family. We knew that Joseph had done a lot of the stenographic notes when Abdu'l-Bahá was in America that are in Star of the West. And we knew that Alma went to Germany to teach the faith, and Fanny went to South Africa at some point to teach the faith. And we knew that they talked about Pauline being basically a very saintly person. Everybody loved her very much. But other than that, in my younger years, I really didn't know a lot. I knew that I was a fifth generation Baha'i. People often ask me about how could that be in America? And so I had explained, but I couldn't tell them a lot about it. And it wasn't until I read Gail Morrison's book, To Move the World, and I have that right here. You know, you can see all the little reference things that I used. When I read that book, I started reading about how Pauline in particular had first a lot about how she had met Louis Gregory and how they had taught him the faith, but also, you know, there's various stories in there that really touched me, and I realized how much they had stepped out of the bounds of culture at that time in the southern city of Washington, D.C., and were making friends with and inviting African-American people to their home. And it just surprised me because I grew up in the 60s. I mean, I was a teenager in the 60s. I knew a lot about the civil rights movement, and I, you know, read a lot of books about it. So I knew that was very unusual to be happening, and it impressed me, and it made me want to learn more about them. So anyway, this book was a big help to me, and I really, at that point, wasn't thinking about writing a book about them. I really, occasionally I thought, well, there should be a book about them, but I didn't think I was up to that. But anyway, later in 95, Robert Stockman came out with his book. And if you notice this one, it's got like tons of markers in it, because his second volume of Baha'i Faith in America really covers that whole period when Pauline and Joseph had become Baha'is, and when all of these Baha'is were actively developing the foundational institutions and activities in America. So his book really filled in a lot of things that I needed to know. And later on, when I was actually writing the book, I had to refer to it many times. So when I was actually asked to write the book, Tim Moore, who worked at the Baha'i Publishing Trust, before the centenary of Abdu'l-Bahá's visit, was looking for people to write about Abdu'l-Bahá in America. And he knew that my grandparents had met Abdu'l-Bahá and great-grandparents. And so he asked me to write the book. And at the time, I was still teaching. I was very busy. I was always very busy with the faith. But that year, I was not elected to be secretary of the Rockford Assembly after 30 years of doing so. And it really was like a sign to me that, okay, well, maybe now I'll have more time to do something like this. I really hadn't, I was not a, published writer or anything, but I had a master's degree. And if you have that, you've written a lot of research papers, and, I knew I could write something. So anyway, I thought, okay, well, I'll just gather all the information I can. And I started looking through more and more of these books and finding little pieces and starting to put it together. But really, when I went to the archives, this is a picture in the archives in Wilmette, and I'm standing with a lady who's also wanted to write a book about the three sisters. And Louis Walker at the archives kind of got us together on the phone from Germany, actually. And we decided that she would write a book about Alma because, she knows German history of the faith. And I would write about Pauline and Joseph primarily in my first book, and then also about Fanny. So there's another book coming out about Fanny, hopefully soon. So anyway, back to the archives. When you're in the archives here, you see the boxes on the table. There's about 30 of those boxes that are just Hannen and Knobloch files. And from the time they became Baha'is, especially Pauline, but Joseph and Pauline knew to keep all those letters that they were writing to each other and all the letters that any of the Baha'is wrote to them, and even copies of letters that they wrote to other people sometimes. So there was this huge collection of information. So if you ever thinking about writing about any of these people, you're going to want to go to the archives here and really search out. But you have to look at the letters that are going to the person you're writing about. That's the ones you'll find in their box. And then you also have to think about, maybe if they wrote to them, maybe the person I'm writing about wrote to the other person. So anyway, you go back and forth, and eventually you'll figure out where you can find all these letters that they wrote back and forth to each other. And in this particular case, all the Knoblochs and the Hannens, even some of their descendants, have letters in that same collection. So you can kind of, I made copies of many of them, and I have huge binders, like a whole shelf full of these copies that I put in chronological order. So that's really how I organized everything. So anyway, that's a first place to start, or maybe second or third place. Also, reading through the Star of the West was a big thing, because Joseph wrote many articles about the things that were going on in DC and other places. And he also put all the things coming from Abdu'l-Bahá. He's the one that would receive them, and then he would put them into the Star of the West. So that's a wonderful place to start too. And then also we've discovered that a lot of the letters were actually housed at the archives in Washington, D.C. And their archives is set up the same way because they had somebody from the National Assembly went there and helped them set up their archives. And there's about 8 boxes that are just Hannen related materials, and a lot of Alma's things are in that archives. So anyway, there was just this huge collection. And once I figured out their handwriting, which in some ways is a little difficult, Fanny's is really tough. Pauline's is nice. But anyway, you have to figure out everybody's handwriting, and then you can manage it. And sometimes when they were writing manuscripts, they typed them up, so that was very helpful. So anyway, that's where I got a lot of my information and got me started. So now I want to, give you an idea of their background. Pauline, her family, the Knoblochs, actually came from Germany right after the Civil War in 1866. The mother and the father on the left here, Amalie and Karl, came in 1866 with 4 children. He was an architect, and as you can imagine, after the Civil War, there was a lot of need for architects in America to rebuild things. So he was asked to come, and he did. And the people on the right side are Amalia's parents, and he's a Count von Rossler. And so that just, you get a little bit of an idea that they actually had money before they came here. Not a lot of money, but they were well off. And some of Fanny's stories, of her early childhood imply that they lived in a big, nice, beautiful home, and they had servants and a big garden and a gardener that worked for them and things like that. So it kind of gave you the impression they did pretty well there. But when they came to America, of course, the melting pot also kind of puts you all in. You have to start out at the bottom because you don't speak English. So anyway, they came here, and he was lucky enough that he worked as an architect, but the family had to learn English and learn all the ways of America. They lived right near, not far from the Capitol building. There's actually stories about them, playing around the Capitol building when they were children. So anyway, they got acculturated pretty quickly. After they came here, they had 3 more children. So this picture on the left is Fanny, and we think it's hard to see, but I think it's Alma probably as a baby in her lap. And then they had another brother, Paul, that was born after that, and Ida. But when they came to America, Ida passed away as about 8 years old, I think. And after she passed away, they had 2 more children. They're on the right side, William, and then Pauline. Pauline was the last one. And actually, they had another baby in between who died as a baby. So, but out of those 7 children that they had, the only ones that were still living at the time when they finally became Baha'is were Fanny, Alma, Pauline, and Amelie, the mother. Joseph, on the other hand, his parents married in 1872, and then he was born in let me see. I've got this little thing in front of my words here, so I'm going to find that, get the dates right. Okay, they were married in 1868. You all can see it, but I can't. And then Joseph was born in 72, and they had another baby in there somewhere. Maybe the first one was before him. But in any case, in 1873, his father, Frank, that's in the picture here, left the family, and apparently there was a situation of abuse and alcohol and other problems going on. And so Mary Virginia was not very sorry to see him go, we'll put it that way. And even though he later contacted them after he'd gotten his life back together and wanted to be a part of it, but she, it seems, didn't want that to happen. So she and little Joey moved to Washington, D.C. When he was young, and he went to school there and grew up there. And she married 2 more times later on, but neither of those lasted very long. And for the most part, she lived with Joseph and Pauline, really, until she died. She died after Joseph died, so the rest of her life she was mostly with them, and was a big help to them because she helped take care of the children, which allowed them to be able to travel and do a lot of the things that they did for the faith. So Pauline and her family had moved to Wilmington, North Carolina when she was young, and there her father was an architect there as well, and there's newspaper accounts there of their activities in the church and different things. But then around the time, well, in 1887, her father passed away from an illness. And then she, within a few years of that, she came back to Washington, D.C. with her mother. And Fanny also came back. And I think Alma had possibly not gone with. She may have been already working by that time, because Fanny is 15 years older than Pauline, and Alma is 10 years older, so they were already grown women by then. But anyway, when she was in high school, she met Joseph. So these pictures were taken around 1891, and they were married in 1893, so not too long after that. And I think some of the letters that we found, show that they really fell in love while they were still in school. And so anyway, that's all in the book, actually. Good reason to read the book. There's a lot of interesting stuff like that. So Joseph and Pauline were married in 1893, created a life together in Washington, D.C. They bought a home. I'm going to look at it later. Actually, I forgot the name of the street. But they stayed in that home for a long time. And Joseph, for a while, was working for the railroads. Let's see, the Southern Railway Company. And then they started having children. Carl, my grandfather, is the baby on the left. That he was born in 1895. They had a daughter in between next, but she passed away as a baby. But you'll see her name on the grave sites. A lot of times people ask me, well, who's Gladys? Well, that's who Gladys was a baby who had died. And then Paul in 1900. So there's Carl and Paul in the middle, and Carl with Amalie on the right. So the story about how they became Baha'is really started quite a little while after that, after Paul was born. In 1901, let me see. I have a technical question here, is whether I can move this little thing. I think I can. I'm going to do that and put it down here because it's in front of a lot of the words. Sorry about that. Whoops. Okay, we got it at the bottom now. Now I can read. I don't know if that affects anybody else, but
No, you're good. Go ahead.
It's good for me. Okay, thank you. Okay, so in 1901, Joseph and Pauline's older sister, Fanny, started working for a company called Viavi. It sold health products, kind of like Shackley or Amway, that kind of a business. And they were doing very well in that business. Both of them trained new people, and they traveled around the area quite a bit. But it wasn't quite as much traveling as what Joseph had done in the railroad. So I think it was partly his plan to take that job was to have more time with his children and with Pauline. So anyway, that was going on. And one of the people that they were training, Mrs. Sargent, had a conversation with Joseph about spiritual matters, and she also talked to Fanny about it. Fanny had kind of a weird reaction, like, what are you talking about that at work for? That's not a topic for work. But Joseph was intrigued by it, and she invited Joseph and Fanny, and then Pauline came along also, to a meeting with a Mrs. Jones who was known for her very powerful prayers. And so the very first thing they went to was what we nowadays would call a devotional gathering, a place where people get together to say prayers with each other. And there's some really funny stories in the book about their reactions, which were very different to that first meeting. And I encourage you to read them. I'm not going to read all of them, but I do want to read one that Pauline wrote about. It's really interesting to think about the reaction a person would have to just going and having prayers with other people. She says, in the year 1902, this humble and unworthy servant was given the pearl of greatest price, the glorious and wonderful message of Baha'u'llah, the returned Christ. Through Mrs. Sargent, my sister Fanny Knobloch, my husband, and myself were invited to call upon a Mrs. Jones, who was and is well known for her gentleness and powerful prayers. This Saturday evening was a memorable one. It seemed to me it was an evening of symbols. We made our visit and were greatly attracted to these ladies because of their joy and sincerity. And although no word concerning this mighty truth was spoken, I felt rather than knew that a great change in my life was soon to take place. So strange was this feeling that on my way home I spoke of it in this way. In the first place, when we left home, the moon and stars were shining brightly, no cloud in the sky. During our visit, it thundered and lightened, and the earth received a great downpour of rain. On leaving, the moon and stars were again shining brightly. Walking home, I was very quiet and thoughtful. At last, I spoke to my sister and husband, saying, "It seems to me that we are on the eve of great changes." They both smiled and asked why. And then I said, "We left home in clear, beautiful weather. While visiting, there was a terrible storm, and now it's clear and calm again. This is a symbol to my mind. We are now contented in our old way of living and thinking. There will soon be a great upheaval and tempest of thought, perhaps, and then peace and contentment." They laughed, and so did I at the picture, but this really was prophetic of my own condition. The next morning, instead of going to my church, I went to Mrs. Jones' prayer meeting. She held every Sunday morning. Again, I was contented and happy. Still, no word concerning the truth of Baha'u'llah. At the close of the meeting, Mrs. Sargent said to me, would you not like to visit a wonderful teacher from Persia? He is able to answer any questions you have concerning the Bible." I rather feared to meet this Oriental, but my love for the truth was greater than my fear of man, so I promised to meet her the next day, Monday, at the rooms of Mirza Abul Faisal, then living on Mass Avenue. I asked my dear mother to go with me. She said, "If it will make you happy, of course, I will go, but I don't think you need him." At 3 o'clock Monday, November 24th, I received a message from this venerable teacher through his interpreter, Mirza Ali Coolican, that completely changed my whole life. From that hour on, I was a new creature. After giving me wonderful answers to my questions, I was told in a straightforward manner that Christ had returned, that the world at large rejected his claim, just as the people always in times past had treated the messengers of God. Although Mirza Ali Coolican went on with proof and argument, I heard nothing, only the words ringing in my ears, "Christ has come again in the flesh." Mirza Kahn has since told me he felt he had wasted time and breath on me. My face was a perfect blank, no sign of interest, denial, belief, opposition, surprise, nor the least sign of understanding. But dear Mirza Abul Faisal had said to him, "She was overcome with spirit. She will be an active believer, and her saint of a mother too." So that was what got them started in the faith. Now, I have other stories from the other side of my family, because my other great-grandparents were also Baha'is, and they lived in the same community and attended the same classes, the Barnettses. And of course, their side of how they became Baha'is was a little bit different than the Knobloch side. But eventually it all kind of melded together because they were in the same community. So anyway, those are some of the things you have to sort out when you write a book like this and figure out whose story is what. But all of the stories from Fanny, Alma, Joseph, and Pauline all revolved around going to these classes and devotionals with first with Mrs. Jones and then later with Mirza Abul Faisal and Ali Coolican. Very foundational. So as soon as Pauline accepted Baha'u'llah as the newest manifestation, her main goal in life, I guess, and mission was to teach the rest of her family about it and her friends. So it took a few years, but she made a lot of visits to Fanny and Amali's home. They lived together in another place in town in Washington, D.C., and then also to Alma's place of residence where she was a seamstress, and we'll get to that story in a minute. Let's see. But during this time, very shortly after she became a Baha'i, and while she was going around teaching her family, she also had something happen that really caused her to get involved in the mission of teaching in the Black community. And that story is one of my favorites and one of the real reasons why I decided that these people need a book written about them, because it was a very brave move and something that really affected the rest of their lives. So I'd like to read that story to you too. Pauline wrote, long before hearing of the Baha'i cause, when I was a little girl in Wilmington, North Carolina, teaching an environment had made me regard colored people with something like terror. I had known of the frightful retribution visited by whites on Negroes for offenses of which I assumed they must be guilty. At about 14, I was brought back to Washington, my birthplace. Walking one day in the shopping district, I found myself watching not the shop windows, but the passers-by. Many had Ethiopian marks, but were almost white or even blue-eyed. Why, I softly exclaimed, before long, we shall not be able to tell colored people from white. How terrible. Years passed, and the problem, for us at least, passed with the years, but not the fear. So this gives you an idea of where her mind was before this. She was definitely part of the culture of the southern parts of the United States and the culture even in D.C. She said, following the crisis in an illness of my baby son, I went to the market for Thanksgiving supplies. Returning to the street, I met a heavily set colored woman, her arms full of bundles, making her way amid the snow and ice in spite of her flopping shoelaces, which she could not stoop to adjust. Something in the picture brought to me a spirit of universal brotherhood. I knelt in the snow and tied the wayfarer's shoes. She was astonished, and those who saw it appeared to think I was crazy. I did not mind this, and from that moment was possessed with a conviction that I must create a work of brotherhood among the colored people. Some words of Baha'u'llah had sunk deep into my consciousness. These, no doubt, were the motivating power which changed the current of my whole life, prompting me to uproot the prejudice of childhood and render loving service to all humanity. Think about that for a minute. And think about these words of Baha'u'llah that had such a huge impact on her life. O children of men, know ye not why we have created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Since we have created you all from the same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land, that from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest. When you think about that, how these words, these few words of Baha'u'llah changed her whole life up to that point. You know, she was probably around 30 years old at that point, and it changed her whole trajectory of her life after that. And she was made it a mission to start teaching in the Black community. The first place she went to was to her washerwoman friend who worked with her, worked at her home, Carrie York. And she says, forthwith I called on my washerwoman, Mrs. Carrie York, who had raised 3 generations of children. Her true Christ spirit attracted me to her home as a good place to begin. To Carrie, I explained the principles of the Baha'i teachings, the prophecies of the Bible and their fulfillment. An understanding of this was given to her, and she was the nucleus of a class meeting in her home composed of friends and neighbors. We used the Kitab-i Kahn, the Book of Certitude, revealed by Baha'u'llah. This was the beginning of a Baha'i mission which multiplied into a number of such groups in the Washington regions. Doesn't that sound familiar to what the Baha'is are being asked to do right now? To bring these messages to the people and then setting up study classes in their homes where they could invite their friends and neighbors. And then Pauline went to those places and taught those classes. And also, I think her sister Alma was involved in this kind of teaching as well. She says the meetings at Carrie York's proved, so far as my experience were concerned, proved to be the candlestick from which the light was spread. To these classes came ministers and teachers and people of various grades of intelligence, many of remarkable refinement. Often the discussions crowded midnight. Then, because of conditions in that pre-taxi era, one of the men would see me safe home, keeping a respectable distance behind, despite urgent appeals to walk at my side. I'm going to think about that for a minute. My husband disapproved of these adventures, but did not seek to prevent me. He watched, expecting this fire of zeal to burn itself out. In the end, he became a tireless worker in the same kind of service, as well as in many other branches of work for the diffusion of the Baha'i teachings. So think about that. I mean, obviously, Pauline was pretty naive about what would happen to those men if they walked next to her down the street in the middle of the night. There was still a lot of lynchings going on in the South at that time for just those kinds of things. So that she was not, she didn't realize what the consequences would be, I guess. But anyway, these kinds of, there was several groups gradually developing in different African-American homes where people were learning about the faith, and they had developed quite a few people who became Baha'is. This next picture, which I found online, and I was thrilled to see it because it's the only actual photograph I have that has somebody in the family, Alma, sitting on the right with a number of the Black friends who lived in, came to the Baha'i meetings in Washington, D.C. at that time. Supposedly, her seamstress, Pocahontas Pope, is in this picture as well, but nobody can identify exactly who she is. But apparently, I know that Pauline used to go to their house or go to where Alma worked, and she and Pocahontas would both listen to her talk about the Baha'i faith and sometimes tell her, because of time and money, you need to stop. But eventually, Alma was the second one in the family to actually become a Baha'i. And that was in 2003, and then in 1904, finally Fanny and Joseph joined the faith as well. Now, during the time that all this teaching was going on in the Black community, we also had Joseph getting very involved with anything that had to do with Persia and Iran. He, along with a few other men, formed the Persian American Education Society, which was meeting in Washington, D.C., and meeting with representatives from Iran who would come, and they really were trying to help build up some businesses there that we could have some trade with that company. He also was involved with, he collected all the money for the Baha'i girls' school that was formed in Tehran. And he would collect the money from contributions and then send it on to them. And they also brought the young lady in this picture a little bit to the right of center, a short woman with a white dress and flowers. That's Gadzia, well, I don't know if I wrote down her whole name, but anyway, she was the first Iranian woman who took advantage of the help from this society that they brought her over so that she could go to school in America, and she ended up staying here. But this is a picture of that Persian American Education Society convention that they had. It's their first annual one. It was their second annual one where Abdu'l-Bahá came and actually was the first place that he went to give his talk when he came to America. But there's a whole chapter in my book about all the Persian connections with Joseph. Another person that I mentioned earlier, this is my other great-grandmother, Leona West Barnetts. She and her husband became Baha'is also in 1902. And from the time she was a little girl, she had been following her father's advice and searching for the return of Christ in the world. And one of the reasons I know that is because there was a letter from Abdu'l-Bahá to her telling her to thank her father for teaching her that, and that was what really helped her to recognize Baha'u'llah. And so those are the mysteries that I always wonder about. How does that happen? But anyway, she followed his advice, and she started going to those same classes, and she became a Baha'i, and her husband did too. And they are given credit for having the first Baha'i summer school. This was they would go to Virginia Beach, I think it was Virginia Beach, Maryland, and they would have these set up tents and stay there for the whole summer, and lots of different Baha'i families would come there, and then they would study together. And in the background there, you can see a little group of people who were there for classes, and that's where the Hannen children and the Barnett's children went to went to those things during the summer, and then went to children's classes in DC the rest of the year. And so they got to know each other, and that's how their daughter, Mineola, and the Hannen's son, Carl, got together, and they eventually got married. One of their daughters, who has almost the same first name, Leona, in the family we called her Loney, but she never married. She became a personal secretary for Agnes Parsons, who was one of the very leading Baha'is in the Washington area. And she organized a lot of the papers, and we really can thank her for having a lot of these papers that we have in the archives. And also she had the diary that Agnes Parsons kept, which was eventually made into a book. So another daughter, Beulah, we called her Aunt Billy. She married and moved to the Milwaukee area. So she was really the first one to move into that area near where I live now. And later on, when Carl and Mineola moved to Milwaukee also, and then eventually went to the House of Worship to work. But anyway, they raised their family there, and they were Baha'is as well. And then this is my grandmother, Mineola Barnetts, who eventually married Carl. And then once they got to the House of Worship, they really spent a lot of time guiding and ushering and helping with like a convention. Often people would stay at their home. They actually were able to, I might show it a little bit later, but they lived in the Hazira which is right across the street, right on the lake, the little house, beautiful house there. And they raised their children there. That's where my father was raised for middle school and high school. And so anyway, that's where a lot of the history began. This is just a picture that I had in my family paper or pictures, and I often wondered, like, where was this taken? And that finally there was a letter that I came across that said from Pauline that they had a Holy Day celebration in their home, and they took it, somebody came and took a flash picture. So I thought, okay, I guess this must be it. So this is a celebration of Nowruz in is it 1906? I get behind on my things, and now the thing is in front of it. Anyway, I think it was 1906 that it was taken. Yep, there it is. Get caught up here. This picture actually shows, on the left is their actual house that they lived in their whole time. Is one of the row houses in D.C. And right after this picture was taken, it was torn down to make room for the D.C. Convention Center. And there's a Starbucks there now. So if you ever go into that area and you have coffee in the Starbucks, you can think about they used to have firesides right there in that home. That's where Louis Gregory learned about the faith. But the picture under it to the right is one that somebody, Lex Musta, took. He went around and found a house that looked just like that and took that picture. So it's right across from the Church of the Immaculate Conception. Okay, another thing, a lot of things were happening around this time. In 1906, Abdu'l-Bahá was looking for a German-speaking Baha'i to help spread the word in Germany. And actually, at first, Fanny is the first one that heard about it. But then as soon as she read it, she said, no, this is for Alma. This is what Alma should be doing. So she gave the letter to Alma and talked her into going and told her that she would help with the financial part of it and send her money every month if she would go and teach the faith there. So she decided to do that. So in 1906, she took off to live back in Germany again. And she had been back a few times in between the time that she came to America. So she was still very fluent in German. And there was still relatives there that she was able to connect with, and some of whom became Baha'is. But by the time she left 15 years later, there was 300 Baha'is in that area. And it's just amazing to read the letters and see just the devotion she had. And she just spent all of her time going to meetings and meeting with people. Even during World War I, she would go and meet with some of the Baha'is who had gotten hurt. Maybe they were in a hospital or at the Red Cross stations. So, I mean, she did a lot. And so the book that Jennifer Wiebers is writing about her, I can't wait to read it. I'm sure it's going to have all those stories in it. There she is with Fanny, who visited her in Germany a few times, and at her desk in Germany. So her precious pictures. They both traveled to Paris together to meet with Abdu'l-Bahá, and she went to London to meet Abdu'l-Bahá. And then when he came there, she saw him there as well. Very shortly, within a couple of years after Alma left, Amali passed away. And I just have to say that the story about her death is one of the most amazing death scenes I've ever heard. It's in the book. And the reason it's there is because Alma was in Germany, and Pauline felt that she had to write all the details about her mother's death and how they thought she was dead, and then she'd come back alive, and then she'd ask for cake and coffee. And I thought sounds like me, and that must be where I get it from. But anyway, she was a very saintly woman, and everybody that talked about her, and especially her death scene, said that they saw the dying of a saint, and they actually could almost see her talking to the angel of death who had come. And she wasn't quite ready because Fanny was somewhere else sick and didn't want to, make her sicker, but she kept saying, "Where's my Fanny? Where's Fanny?" And when Fanny finally came and saw her, then she was ready to go. So that's an amazing story that's all in the book. But right before that happened, Pauline and Joseph had already bought boat tickets, to go on pilgrimage and to meet Abdu'l-Bahá. And when that happened, they realized that they couldn't leave right then. They had to stay and deal with everything. But Fanny, they gave the tickets to Fanny, and then another lady, Ida Finch, who was a friend of the family, and they went together, and then they went to Naples and picked up Alma, and they were able to take that letter with all the details and to tell Alma in person that her mother had passed. So they felt that was the best thing to do at the time. And then a year later, Pauline and Joseph went on their pilgrimage. And of course, when they were there at that time, they were able to meet Bahia Khanum, Baha'u'llah's sister, and Munira Khanum, who was Abdu'l-Bahā's wife. She's on the right. And then they also met Shoghi Effendi. And there's a cute little story in the book about how he would bring his slate in with Alma and meet with her, and she would help. She was trying to teach him English. He said, "I want to know Spanglish." And so from very early on, he was very interested in learning English. And as most people know, he went to Oxford later and became extremely good at English and has written many, many letters to America, which prove his good English. So they also, any women at that time who went on pilgrimage were especially privileged to spend a lot of time with the women of the family. So these are some of the people. In the middle is Bahia and Munira, and then Munira's 4 daughters, and then some of the grandchildren and other women. I don't know who all the people are, but anyway. So one of the people that Pauline and Joseph introduced to the faith was Louis Gregory. And I put this in here because right before they went on pilgrimage is when he had started coming to their firesides, and they were meeting with each other pretty regularly. But then when he went away, when they went on pilgrimage, he says that he kind of lost interest for a little while. And I'm trying to find the right thing here to say. But I'll tell you a little bit about how he got interested. He was working at the Treasury Department, and there were 2 men working with him, and one of them had been a Confederate soldier, and the other one had been a Union soldier in the Civil War. And here he is working right with them in the same department. And he listened to their arguing with each other back and forth and back and forth. And often he had to be the peacemaker and kind of bring the discussions together. But one of those men had heard about the Baha'i faith and knew of the meetings. So they invited him to Carrie York's house, where they first met the Hannens. So that was around 1907. Pauline wrote about that. One night at Carrie York's, a handsome, intelligent-looking colored gentleman, yes, I mean just that, holder of degrees from several universities, entered that home. Abashed by so much scholarship, I was flushed and nervous, but thought Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá sustained me, and I taught the lessons without confusion. The visitor was so impressed with the words of Baha'u'llah as revealed in the Kahn that he could not let it go. This was Louis Gregory. For a year or 2, he would attend the various meetings, and at the close of the week would come to our home. He told us afterward, "I came wondering whether you and Mr. Hannen could talk intelligently on other subjects or only on religion. I discovered you are both interested in many topics, but after a while you would both automatically return to the Baha'i teachings. Doesn't that sound kind of familiar? I thought there must be something in it after all. We had been praying that someone among the Negro race would arise to serve them more effectively. We believed Louis to be the answer to that. So Louis continued to attend Baha'i meetings until the Hannens left on a pilgrimage to meet Abdu'l-Bahá in Akka. Louis wrote about this. He said, during this period, Mr. and Mrs. Hannen went on their pilgrimage to the Holy Land. As they were my sole connection with the faith, my interest waned during their absence. A long time afterwards, I learned that they had kindly mentioned me to the master, who had instructed them to continue teaching me, assuring them that I would become a believer and an advocate of the teachings. Upon their return, they remade the connection. Through the very unusual kindness of these dear friends, my mental veils cleared away and the light of assurance mercifully appeared within when they had taught me the greatest name and how to pray. I became a confirmed believer about June 1909 and thereafter cooperated with the Hannens in arranging meetings and trying to give everyone its message. So the decision to become a Baha'i was not an easy one for Louis. A lot of his friends thought he was unbalanced. He got a lot of flack from the black community about that and joining this group of predominantly white people. And some of his friends were people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker Washington and others who had very contrasting and different ideas about how the Negro and the black people at that time should become a part of America after the Civil War. I mean, there was a lot of different approaches discussed and they had different ideas. And Louis's idea fell along the lines with the Baha'i, that the black and the white people needed to come together, work together as equals, and find a way to have understanding and love for each other, basically. So after he became a Baha'i, he started teaching his friends, and he had some white friends who actually were very interested. So here's a little bit about that. This was actually written up in the Baha'i News. It said, on the evening of March 6th, an important gathering assembled at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Hannen, representing the joining in one meeting of the white and the colored Baha'is and friends of the city. That actually is noted as probably being the first interracial meeting that they had in a white home. Considerable work is being done among the latter, and a regular weekly meeting is held at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Dyer on Wednesdays. Those were friends of Louis's whose names he had given to Pauline as someone interested in the faith and willing to start a class in their home. In February of last year, Abdu'l-Bahá commanded that to prove the validity of our teachings and as a means of removing existing prejudices between the races, a spiritual assembly or meeting be held, preferably at the home of one of the white Baha'is, in which both races joined. This is the first meeting of that character, and it was repeated monthly after that. Another home that was also another place that was found was the Music Conservatory, which was run by a Mrs. Marshall, who was another of the so-called colored Baha'is, and it's in Washington, D.C. So they started having several places around town where they had mixed meetings of blacks and whites together. Another person that the Hannens got to know very well was the cooks, Coralie Cook and her husband George, who were both professors at Howard University with very, very impressive credentials, as you can see. And Mrs. Cook became a Baha'i in 1913 as a result of the Hannens' efforts. She was also very instrumental in arranging for Abdu'l-Bahá to speak at Howard University since they worked there. And another thing that really impressed me was that she wrote, and the letter is in this book, Lights of the Spirit, which is a collection of writings of African American people, Baha'is in the early days. And she wrote a magnificent letter to Abdu'l-Bahá that explained the condition, the racial conditions in America before he even came here. And I think it's well worth reading to get an idea of what, from her perspective, what was going on. But they made a lot of contributions to the faith, and she spoke at many things, and he did too, actually. So another person that is given, the Hannens are given credit for teaching, was Alain Locke, who is best known as the Dean of the Harlem Renaissance. And he was also a professor at Howard University. And he taught a lot of things about cultural pluralism, which is very much along the lines of the Baha'i perspective that, you know, we have to appreciate all the different cultures, but they also have to be able to come together and work together to make a better society. So he was known for that. He was also the first Black Rhodes Scholar to Oxford. And interestingly, when he arrived there, they didn't realize that he was Black, and they then had a dilemma of where to have him live, because at that time, Black and white people just didn't live together like that. So they had to find him a place to live. But eventually, anyway, he became a very prominent speaker. He spoke in many, many places. He became very well known, and he was called the Dean of the Harlem Renaissance, partly because of a book that he wrote called The New Negro, which talks about, it teaches about a lot of Black culture, even from Africa and other places, and different art, both spoken and written, and, you know, music and all different kinds of arts that were contributions of Black people at that time. So anyway, very well-known man. And an interesting story about him was that when after he died, somehow or other his ashes were given to somebody at Howard University and made their way into a drawer in the archives and stayed there for a long, long time. And then finally, fairly recently, just a few years ago, they were discovered. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, this is a very important man, and his ashes need to be somewhere better than in this drawer. So they organized to have him built at the Capitol Hills Congressional Cemetery. And people from the Black Rhodes Scholar group and the National Baha'i Assembly, and also he was gay, so there was a group of from the Gay Pride movement. I don't know exactly who that would be, but anyway, they all got together, collected funds, and bought this, you know, a marker and a grave plot for him. And all these people got together and had a special ceremony to dedicate his gravesite. And my granddaughter happened to be going to Howard University at the time, and she was able to be a part of that ceremony and put dirt in the grave. And I just thought it was interesting because I had actually never heard of him before that. And so when that happened, I started looking him up, and I bought his book, which I have over here too. There's a whole book about Alain Locke. Can you see it? Oh, there it is. And Faith and Philosophy by Christopher Buck, who was a Baha'i. And it really goes through it and tries to show how Alain Locke was very involved with the Baha'i faith for a good part of his life. So let's see, where are we? This next part, I'm just trying to give you little snippets of things that you can find a lot more about in the book. So there's quite a bit about Louis and his wife, Louisa, who was a white woman, and they met when he went on his pilgrimage. They met, got to know each other a little bit, and Abdu'l-Bahá seemed to feel that they really had a connection and liked each other. And so he actually encouraged them, not telling them they should get married, but making it clear that it was okay with him if they did. And they eventually did. And they made it, they didn't publicize it a lot. They didn't have a big wedding or anything, but they kept Pauline and Joseph very aware of all the plans that were being made. And they were very much supporters of this marriage. I wanted to put this quote in here because it just says so much about how Abdu'l-Bahá felt about this and felt about all the mixed meetings that were going on in D.C. and various things like that. So let me read that for you. O ye dear ones of Abdu'l-Bahá, in the world of existence, the meeting is blessed when the white and the colored race meet together with infinite spiritual love and heavenly harmony. When such meetings are established and the participants associate with each other with perfect unity, love, and kindness, the angels of the kingdom of Abha praise them, and the beauty of Baha'u'llah addresses them. Blessed are you, and again, blessed are you. This is a little story about when, in 1909, when Pauline and Joseph actually made their pilgrimage. Pauline was very much into all this teaching in the Black community, and she knew that Abdu'l-Bahá would understand some of the trials she was going through, and she writes about this, and it's very, very important, I think. I know that time is like moving along here. I'm just seeing this, so I'm going to try to, but this one is definitely important. She says, I was a very earnest, ardent worker among the colored people. To my knowledge, I was the first to work among them, and then later my sister Alma and Joseph, my husband. Alma had gone to Germany, so her work ceased with the colored people in Washington, but Joey and I continued without her. At that time, the colored people were not so fond of my husband, and he was the intellectual type. When we went to Akka in 1909, it was with a hopeful heart that Abdu'l-Bahá would understand my work among the colored race, because I had many drawbacks. There were many to tell me I was wasting my time, that I would do much better and more credible work among my people. When the boys of the neighborhood knew that colored people were coming to meetings at our house, they would throw bricks and stones and overripe tomatoes and vegetables in our vestibule, and also unhinge the front gate. I would sit by the door in the hall and quietly hide these things back of the vestibule door so that the friends never knew. My husband would unhinge the gate and put it in a safe place until the meeting was over, replacing it later. All these happenings really brought joy to my heart, I believed, contrary to the others that Abdu'l-Bahá would understand. During our visit in 1909, one morning, Abdu'l-Bahá came to the room very briskly and said, "How are you? Are you happy? Are you well?" And then he made several other remarks, and he turned to my husband and said, "Tell me about the race question in Washington." So after having spoken at length on the subject, he swiftly left the room and walked in a large circle in the central room, another room anyway. Hearing him walking briskly, we followed him and stood close to the wall, together with several Persians, and watched this majestic figure pace back and forth. The power of the Holy Spirit was almost too much for us. We practically shrank against the wall, overwhelmed, when suddenly, like a bow out of an arrow, he came towards us. We did not know what was going to happen. Placing his hand on my husband's shoulder and looking into his eyes with great power, he said, "May you be the means of uniting the colored and the white races." And then he walked out and left us. Now think about that for a minute. Can you imagine Abdu'l-Bahá saying that directly to you? Here's the moral, she says. It was for me a clean, deep operation, and I learned and have never since forgotten the lesson. He doeth whatsoever he willeth, and commandeth whatsoever he desireth. Many times after that I knew the wisdom of Abdu'l-Bahá, turning and giving this command to my husband. My husband did all in his power to obey the command of Abdu'l-Bahá, and eventually became much beloved of the colored people. So, let that sink in for a minute. I'm going to really quickly go through some of the rest of this just to give you an idea of other things that are in the book. Pauline is known as the mother of Baha'i Sunday schools in America. They started a school there. They had children, classes with both black and white children in the classes. And then I also have several chapters in the book about Abdu'l-Bahá coming to America, and he always was hoping to have mixed racial groups wherever he went, and he would work with Pauline and Joseph to make sure that would happen. He spoke at Howard University, and I won't tell that whole story, but there's some really good stories in there about that. There's a picture. Some of these pictures that actually I drew them, and I'm working on a children's book, and so all of these are going to go into that children's book about Pauline and the challenging issue. So let's see. There's another really cute story in there about the laying of the cornerstone. You can see Joseph to the right of Abdu'l-Bahá here, and I think Pauline maybe is right behind Abdu'l-Bahá, but she was able to be one of the shovelers to represent Germany, and she did a really good job. It's a funny story. She longed to have him speak at her or come to her house for dinner, which he finally was able to do. And he also gave a wonderful talk there about Baha'u'llah's servant Isfandiar, who was an Ethiopian man, much loved by the family. And just a few other pictures of him in America. And I found this cute picture of Fanny and Pauline right when Abdu'l-Bahá was leaving to go back to Haifa, or actually, not sure where he went, maybe Egypt first, or Europe, never mind. But anyway, when he left America. There's a picture here of Joseph. I found this hanging in my uncle's house, and I just had to have a copy of it because here he is, the ultimate secretary. And there's a whole chapter about him being the amazing things he did as a secretary for the southern states, for the Washington, D.C. Baha'is, the Persian group, all kinds of things. He was just amazing. Very organized man. Also, this book came out by Louis Venter. I have a copy of this as well. And I found a bunch of stories in there. It came out after my book was in print, and all these things about Joseph Hannen following up after Louis Gregory's teaching that he was doing. So just had to throw that in. This is just a picture of, this is my grandparents, Carl Hannen and Mineola Barnett. And they got married right after the end of World War I. Abdu'l-Bahá wrote a tablet for them and such, and then they had children. And the picture of the three children on the bottom left is, the middle one is my father, Sohail. Sohail was born in 1919, so Abdu'l-Bahá was still living, and so therefore Abdu'l-Bahá, through Ahmed Sohrab, sent a message to name him Sohail. So he lived with that name his whole life. Actually, mostly was called Sohi. But just not too long after that, it was a tragic event when Joseph Hannen died in a car crash. And there's a lot in the book there. Almost every known Baha'i at the time sent letters of condolence, but they were beautiful letters that really, you could learn a lot about the spiritual world and life after death from a Baha'i perspective, just from reading those letters. Many of them wondering, like, why would God take such an amazing man? But they also said, well, maybe God needed him on the other side. And I found it interesting. I started thinking, after I started giving these talks, what happened right after that was Abdu'l-Bahá called for the Baha'is in D.C. to organize the first race amity convention. And when you think about who was on the committee, here they are. All these people that Pauline and Joseph had taught were on those first committees and participated in those first race amity conventions. And I just think that's amazing, and that it's taken all this time for this book to come out right at the time when our Universal House of Justice and National is also calling for us to have race amity celebrate that day, June 9th, and have these events. There's just a picture of Alma when she came back from Germany and did a lot of travel teaching all over the country. And also Fanny at that time is when she left for South Africa. She went on 3 different trips, and for most of the 1920s she was in South Africa. And Pauline went in 1925. Martha Root met her there also in 1925. And actually it was a letter that Martha wrote to Pauline that encouraged her the most to finally decide to come and join Fanny for a year. Let's see. And then in the 30s is when Carl actually came and started working at the House of Worship when the outside part of it was being put on. So they lived in the Hazira at that time and worked at the temple and gave a lot of service. There's the Hazira on the left, and then the little building on the right. When Horace Holly became secretary and ended up moving into the Hazira, they moved into the house on the right, which eventually became the Baha'i National Center, and then they moved on to another house in Wilmette. And just a few pictures here that, you know, of my parents, my dad and his sister and brother in a youth group in the 1940s, and then he married my Aunt Barbara's best friend, Frances Ogle, who was my mother. And she became a Baha'i shortly after they got married and raised all 5 children as Baha'is, and they all are still Baha'is. The picture on the right is when Carl and Mineola were having their 50th wedding anniversary down in Florida. And there's a Sunday school picture with me and my brothers and sisters and the Stokely family and the Baker family and a bunch of other people from that era. And then at my home on the right is some of my nieces and nephews and families, my brothers and sisters, and so on. So in 2001, 3 generations of Pauline and Joseph's family came and rededicated their gravesite. That's an interesting story that's in the book. So it had been completely, you couldn't even find it. But anyway, we found it and we put new gravestone on it. And we had a nice ceremony there. And I finally got to meet a lot of Paul Hannen's side of the family who stayed out east. So there we go. After 10 years of research and reviews, I finally got my book published in April. And I'll end with this slide. The 3 Knobloch sisters will ever be connected in people's hearts. As the Abdu'l-Bahá called them, the 3 lighted candles. And this picture actually hangs in Baji, where Baha'u'llah is interred. So I think that's it. You still awake over there?
The size of the audience has actually grown.
Really?
Judy, you started out with it actually increased in size in spite of the fact that you went really much longer than we had anticipated. But you kept everyone's attention very well, and
thank you.
I understand the Facebook page has been lighting up like a candle with all kinds of comments, and I haven't had a chance to go look, but I think Boyd may forward some of those to us as well.
Okay.
Those as well.
Well, there's so much in that book, and I had to take 200 pages out because they said it was too long, and so you can imagine. And then I wrote another whole book about Fanny because there was so much. There's just a lot of things in the archives.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I hadn't realized your connection with the Barnettses. I didn't realize that I'd heard the name Barnetts, but I'd never really.
Well, you wrote about them in your book.
Yeah, I mentioned them a few times. But I didn't know that there was a marriage connection between them and the Hannens later on.
Yeah.
Really, really cool. I didn't know who Coralie Cook was either, so that's really fantastic. Fantastic information
Well, good.
for me as well. I really, really enjoyed it immensely. We do have some chats, and I think we have some Q&As.
Okay.
Let me see here. What do we have? Steve Collins notes, it's nice that their first night when they were hearing about the faith was stormy, because I guess Louis Gregory's first meeting with
Yeah, that was too, actually.
was also stormy. So he said that was an interesting connection.
It was.
And people were quite amazed. People were actually throwing bricks and stones at the house for hosting meetings with African Americans.
Yes. An interesting side to that is that around that time, Carl was having some problems with some of the kids, and they don't really specify what the problems were, but I can imagine it had to do with that. And so Abdu'l-Bahá suggested that they take him away from there, and so he went to Germany and lived with Alma for a couple of years. He got his high school degree there and learned German and stuff. So, but they don't really say that's why he did that, but they said he was having some problems, and I can see that that would have caused problems.
Absolutely. That was the kind of behavior that to so many people was just unacceptable of that era.
Yeah.
And
yes,
it's hard being ahead of your time, really.
Very true.
Your time.
But the time is now, though. I hope that people will get the message from this book that this is a challenging issue, but it's something that the Baha'is are called to do, and we need to be like Pauline.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's see. So one person says, wonderful work. Charlotte says, I'm listening and enjoying this. Sue Emil says, your story brings tears to my eyes and a deeper yearning and longing in my heart. I feel like such a pitiful waif for lack of such a history of my own, and yet I am very grateful to be part of making history in whatever small way I am given.
Wow.
Thank you for sharing your very rich heritage so generously. And,
you're welcome.
so that was Sue. And I think, I can't tell if this is Sue or Stevie. Your newfound path of service in the cause of God will be greatly enriched by these stories. Merat says, delightful, thank you, very rich and important history. Charlotte says, loves the drawings, precious. So that's some of the comments that we've gotten. I think some of those were on the Facebook page that have been forwarded to us. So we don't have any questions.
Well, that's great. And I should mention that I have a Facebook page for the book called Aflame with Devotion, Hannens and Noblocks. So if people could go to that and put some messages, that would be wonderful.
That's a good idea.
I'd like to hear them.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Nadal says, delighted to hear these magnificent stories from early history of our faith and becoming a children's book. So that's true. I've always thought the story of Pauline reaching down and tying the African-American woman's shoe was one of the most precious stories really in the faith. And then being moved to do this because of the hidden word by Baha'u'llah, know ye not why we created you all from the same dust. It really excites me, moves me to hear that particular story.
That's what inspired me to write the book, really. That and Tim Moore putting a little pressure on me.
That's right. Well, Tim is good that way. He's very concerned with making sure we get our history recorded, of course. How many African American believers in Washington, D.C. do you think the Hannens taught? Do you have a number? I'm curious.
Well, it's hard to say because they were all meeting in these homes, and the Hannens went to the firesides. Louis Getzinger was a part of that too, and Miriam Haney and some others. So, like the people in your own community who become Baha'is, they've been coming around, you can't take credit for all of them. But there was probably, it seems to me, I heard that there was maybe 30 or 40. I could be wrong. The Washington, D.C. Baha'is probably know that better than I do, that were active in that period. And they had some difficulties because some of the Baha'is really didn't want to bring their friends to mixed meetings because they knew that would scare them away. And there was even people who really expressed that these teachings are for 1,000 years from now, not for now. It was kind of crazy. I have letters about these things. And one of the chapters in the book discusses that whole issue, how to deal with that at a time when having mixed meetings was really almost dangerous for people.
Right. I think that's one of the reasons Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged the Gregories to marry, because a lot of Baha'is would say, oh, yes, we believe in the oneness of humanity. Mixed marriages, well, maybe someday that might be possible.
Well, some of them said, no way.
and people did say, people did say after the marriage had happened, they'd say, this was not a good idea. This is confusing for people. It's damaged the reputation of the faith. It'll make it harder for white people to become Baha'is. Yeah. So there was those kinds of reactions.
It was a big conflict in the community, and they had to find a way to come together with all those issues. And so anyway, it is discussed in there, and To Move the World is another one that has a lot about that in it.
And there's so much more that now is known about Louis Gregory, even compared to the 1980s when Gail put together To Move the World. She's found so much more information about Louis Gregory's stepfather and the family life in Charleston and all that. So it's really quite amazing what's available. And I hope we can find more out about Pocahontas Pope, too, because she's a very significant figure in the African-American community in Washington, D.C. as the first one.
Yeah,
So.
And Coralie Cook and Carrie York and some others. I mean, I'm just scratching the surface here. And what I hope this book will do is help, bring other people to find things in their history and their community. They, especially Alma and Fanny, traveled all over the Central States and the South and taught. And if you, live in those places and you have any of that in your archives, bring it up, bring it to that Aflame with Devotion thing. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So. Yeah, one person just commented, if the community was growing very fast, it must have swept the attitudes of society. It must sweep in the attitudes of the society and had to be processed. And I think that's, that's true. Another person just wrote, beautiful story of the early believers, an interesting story of the blacks in her story.
I have another whole PowerPoint that I mean, some of it overlaps, but I particularly highlight that part of the story. And so who knows, if you'd ever like me to come back and do just that one, I'd be glad to do it.
That's a possibility. And certainly we'll want you to come back and do one on Fanny once you've got that ready.
Yes, when that one comes out.
Yeah,
I don't have as many pictures of her, but some anyway.
How long do you think that's going to be? A couple of years?
They haven't set the date for, appointed an editor yet. So we're really in the beginning, but they did say they'd like to do it. So.
Have you written the manuscript yet?
Yeah, the whole book is finished. I've given it to them. And in that book, it's mostly letters that she wrote back and forth to Pauline and manuscripts that she wrote. So, and there's not as much things about Abdu'l-Bahá, so it won't have to be as thoroughly vetted as this book was. This one took a long time. It was 2 years at the World Center being checked over, and so it took quite a while. But I think the ones after this will not take so long, I hope.
Yeah, really.
So.
Sue says, I'm so grateful to have your book right here in front of me as you speak. It has come to life in all new and deeper dimensions. And she says, your book will be crucial to use as an exemplary text for teachers who are continually raised up to carry forward the Hannen service to this most vital and challenging issue.
Great.
And
that's Steve, what I want to hear.
Yeah, and Steve, who lives in North Carolina, says, I hope there's more about the life in Wilmington, North Carolina, where the first Baha'i joined the religion later, thanks to Louis Gregory.
So that part is before they were Baha'is, so they were not as meticulous at keeping records, and they were all together. They weren't writing to each other, so there's not that much in the archives, but there is in newspaper archives. Like that's where I learned a little bit about their activities.
Mm-hmm. Steve, take notice. This particular Steve is an expert at finding things in old newspapers.
There you go.
He adds, I hope there's more.
Oh, is he from Wilmington? He might have contacted me,
Steve
actually.
Collins he's from North Carolina, so he's
Oh, okay.
he's an expert at finding things in newspapers.
Good.
He says, yes, it's me. I hope there's more about life in Wilmington. Yeah. So he may be able to find some things and make a note.
Actually, I don't know if it was him. I think he's the one that sent me a bunch of stuff that I ended up using. I put it in the Fanny book because this book was already, published by then.
Yeah, he said, yes, I did. Yay.
Good. Thank you, Steve.
Don't have any other questions right offhand, I don't think. I think that's most of everything. We don't have anything in the other forum yet. I must say I was very impressed by all this information because there's so much you have about Washington, D.C. that I never had a chance to really dip into in detail. And I'm going to have to look.
And I just scratched the surface of what's available. But their handwriting is a little difficult. Yeah. Luckily, I was a teacher and I taught people who didn't know English very well. So I can figure it out, but it's not easy.
Be thankful you don't have to read Charles Mason Remy's writing. I'll tell you that.
I've read some of his. Yeah,
that is really bad.
Some of that is in there.
He's really almost illegible. And there were some things I think that Alma, when she was writing back to Washington, D.C. about Germany, I never could quite figure out the names of a few of the people she was talking about. Schnöbel, Schnabely, something like that. Never was quite sure who she was talking about. She spelled it different times.
Well, that's the trouble too. And her English wasn't, great, so she had to deal with that too, and spelling.
Yeah, that was a funny situation.
They would talk about, Pauline would say she had to go over some of Alma's things and English them up. She was born and raised in America, so her English was good.
I'm amazed that there were 300 German Baha'is in 1921. That's really impressive because that's more Baha'is in Germany than would have been in either England, all of England, and Paris combined. I doubt Paris and England combined I doubt they had 100, 120.
That might have been a Wikipedia thing, so who knows?
Well, the number came from somewhere.
Yeah.
It is true. It is true from what I saw, because the thing that was different was that Alma was reaching the middle class. Some wealthier people, maybe a few poorer people, but she was reaching the middle class. Paris was reaching expatriates. They were reaching intellectuals and foreigners mostly. And in England, the London community was, near as I could tell, wealthy. Manchester was different. Manchester was a poorer community, and Manchester was a larger Baha'i community. And I think reaching the middle class actually, in some ways, is more effective than just attracting intellectuals. So I think that's part of the success in Germany myself.
She also did a lot of teaching with young people, which surprised me because she was in her probably 60s when she was there, 50s at least. But she would meet with young groups of women in particular and had a great success with that. And then also, some of the aristocracy and all kinds of people. She really seemed to connect with everybody. Yeah. Even during the war, she would meet with Baha'is who were soldiers who were in at the Red Cross or whatever they called it there. But anyway, she seemed to be able to connect with everybody. Amazing.
That's true. I don't have any other questions. I don't see any other questions right offhand. Do you have any parting thoughts or comments you'd like to make?
Well, I guess the one comment for people out there, if they're still listening, I really do love to travel around the country, and I'm very willing to come and even just sit in a living room with a small group of Baha'is someplace. I like to meet people and then have a discussion about particularly the racial issues that are brought up in the book. But I think this is I've enjoyed doing that so far, and I would love to do it more. So if you just find a way to contact me through the Facebook page or something,
or they
message me or whatever.
That Woman Institute can pass the information on as well. Well, and you've done such a marvelous job, not only writing this up, but really being able to explain it and talk about it. It's really, really been quite a fantastic program today, Judy, and we're really grateful that you've
Well,
been
thank
able
you.
to
Thank you very much.
provide this.
It's a topic. I'm very involved with eliminate racism in Rockford, Illinois, and a number of things like involved with that. So it's very important to me. So I'm glad to go talk about it anywhere.
Well, thank you again, and we're really very grateful. And I want to thank everyone today for having joined us. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.